Hello again. All right, so as I mentioned at the end of the last video lecture, this lecture will be about what we call coronary circulation, which refers to the blood flow to the walls of the heart itself. And so as I mentioned earlier, you might think, well, the walls of the heart itself, they just gets its blood supply from the blood that's passing through the heart chambers. And that's not true. You actually have a system of blood vessels that extend throughout the walls of the heart itself to supply blood to the myocardium, all those cardiac muscle fibers that you have in there. Very, very important, obviously, because all that pumping the heart does takes energy. What do you need for energy? Oxygen gas, glucose. You're making lots of wastes that have to be carted away, like CO2. So all of this network of blood vessels is called the coronary circulation. Now here's a model of the coronary circulation. So you're actually seeing the myocardium and the other heart tissues taken away, and all you see left there are the system of arteries, arterioles, and the capillaries are not really shown, but then the venules and the veins that circulate blood to the walls of the heart itself. All right, the left ventricle receives most of this blood supply. That makes sense. We talked about earlier how the myocardium of the left ventricle is actually thicker than it is in the right ventricle. And why is that? Because the left-hand side of the heart is going to pump blood out through the systemic circulation, so it has to generate more force to squeeze that blood outward to all of your tissues. The amount of arterial supply varies among individuals. That just means that the blood vessel networking that you have, yes, there are some major arteries and major veins that we all have in common, but then there are some individual differences as you get into some of these smaller ones that extend all throughout the walls of the heart. Also, there are natural bypasses for blood flow within the walls of the heart. Those are called anastomoses or junctions. And really what that's referring to, I'll get my, oops, didn't mean to do that. My iPad's not cooperating with me here. An anastomoses, all right, so if you have a little tiny artery here that's located somewhere, within the wall of the heart, like maybe we're zoomed in over here, and there's one that's kind of adjacent, it's not unusual to have little connections like that between two arteries, both of which contain oxygen-rich blood. It's like a bridge between the two. And again, that's anastomoses is plural. Anastomosis with an I instead of the E would be singular. This is good though, because imagine, if you had a blockage right in here, like that little artery was blocked, which is not unusual. We have lots of heart patients who have those types of problems. Then the blood can still wind up flowing around that in some way. And you have other little extra passageways for blood to get distributed throughout the walls of the heart. Now, those work for minor type blockages, but if you have a blockage where you actually have a blood clot, an undesirable blood clot in one of the major arteries of the heart, like some of these larger ones you see up in here, those anastomoses, those little different pathways that blood can take, don't work. Those are really important for smaller arteries. All right, so I'm going to shift over to visible body and show you guys which of the major blood vessels of the coronary circulation you need to be able to identify as part of the anatomy required for chapter 18. So I'm going to flip over there. All right, so I've got my heart back up here from visible body. We're going to rotate it around and take a look at what's going on with your coronary circulation. All right, let me kind of move my heart down here for a second. All right, now we've learned, all right, so the walls of the heart, the deeper tissues you see within the walls of the, deep to what you're looking at here at the surface, you got to have little tiny blood vessels bringing oxygenated blood to all the cardiac muscle fibers you've got within the walls of the heart itself. All right, so where does oxygen-rich blood leave the heart? Right there, the base of the aorta. So it's coming out of the left-hand side of the heart over here. Visible body's being kind of annoying to me right now. Come on. It's kind of hard to rotate this around, but this is the left-hand side of the heart. Oxygen-rich blood gets pushed up past that aortic semilunar valve into the base of the aorta. Okay. Some of that blood winds up, a pretty fair percentage of it, a surprising percentage of it, takes an exit right away. All right, and it's going to wind up supplying the walls of the heart itself. So let me deselect that. All right, what I'm going to do is I want to show you major arteries. All right, I'm going to line up that one. This is called your right coronary artery. That's one of them. So you can see right there, that's connected into the base of the aorta. So that is carrying oxygen-rich blood down this way. And then there are going to be lots of smaller arteries that detour or exit off of that one to supply blood to the right atrium and a big portion of the right ventricle over here. There's your right coronary artery. And if we rotate it, keep rotating the heart around. So now we're kind of, see how it flows along the border between the right atrium here and the right ventricle over here. And we keep rotating around that way. All of that's the right coronary artery. So even though it's not shown, you're going to have smaller arteries that are branching off and distributing blood to the wall of the right ventricle and the right atrium. Now you do have couple of major branches off the right coronary artery that you need to know. Let me deselect that one. But right there, that one's called the right marginal artery. So you need to be able to identify that one. You got lots of other, oops, let me deselect that. That's your right marginal artery right there. It's kind of down along this lower right margin of the heart, lower part of the heart, where it's leading to. This is your apex over here, that little pointy feature that you have on the heart. So that's one major artery that branches off the right coronary artery. And here's your right coronary artery again, highlighted in light blue. And here's another major branch right there. This is called the posterior, let me deselect the other ones. This one right here is called the posterior interventricular artery. So be sure you're looking at these terms on your study guide for chapter 18. Posterior interventricular artery. So what does interventricular mean? Between the ventricles. So if we sliced open the heart right in here, you know, this is your left ventricle over here, this is the right ventricle over here. We're looking upward at the bottom of the heart. Here's your inferior vena cava, the base of it, where it's been cut off. So we're looking on the underside of the heart. And right in here, you know, kind of a little thick area in there, that is your interventricular septum that we were taking a look at before. The wall between the two ventricles is down in there. So that's a major branch of the right coronary artery. So know that one, know your right marginal artery, and also know there that's your right coronary artery supplying blood over to the right-hand side of the heart. If you don't have the diagrams out that I've provided to you on Blackboard for helping you label heart anatomy features, you probably would be useful to you to have those out. All right, now as far as the left coronary artery, I am going to hide the right atrium so we can see it better. This whole body's being kind of awkward here with my with my heart rotation. Hopefully I'm not making you dizzy. Here's the left ventricle, right ventricle over here. All right, so there's the base of the aorta. So we said some of that oxygen-rich blood detours over here into the right coronary artery, and then some of it detours over here into the left coronary artery. So the left coronary artery is there behind. What is that? That's the base of the pulmonary trunk. Okay. And then pretty quickly, the left coronary artery has two major branches. One of them's right here, highlighted in light blue. Let me deselect the left coronary artery, the first part of it. All right, so all of that you see there are, this is called the anterior interventricular artery. So you had a posterior one on the backside. Here you've got the anterior interventricular artery on the left-hand side of the heart. And they're showing you lots of its branches that extend off of there as well. All right, so again, the separation, here's your left ventricle over here, right ventricle over here. So if you sliced open the heart, you would see the interventricular septum, that wall between the two ventricles would be right down in there. So this is supplying blood, to a great deal of the left ventricle and the right ventricle. So that's a pretty important artery. So this is one of those where you would not want a blockage. And if you had a blockage like right there, not good, because that's going to cut off. If you had a thrombus right in there, undesirable blood clot, that would cut off the oxygenated blood supply to large portions of the left and the right ventricles. That would not be cool. All right, let me deselect that. And again, we've got our left atrium up there has been cut off. There's the left coronary artery. And then here's its other big branch. This is called the circumflex artery. Circumflex being used in the sense like circumference, circular. And all right, let me deselect that for a second. I'm going to strip off this large vein for a second so we can see the circumflex artery a little bit better. All right, there's your circumflex artery. It's kind of circling around. And then these two guys are a couple of branches of the circumflex artery. This is the main part of the circumflex artery where it's kind of circling around that border between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So do be able to identify that branch as well. All right, those are your major arteries. Now these arteries lead to smaller arteries that dig down into the myocardium, and then those are going to branch into arterioles, just like we have in the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Same deal with your coronary circuit. Those lead to capillaries, microscopic blood vessels that provide oxygenated blood to specific locations where you have cardiac muscle fibers down in there. Those cardiac muscle cells, muscle fibers, are generating CO2 and other wastes that the blood has to pick up. And those lead to venules, which lead to coronary veins that are going to bring this deoxygenated blood that has waste and CO2 in it. And that blood is going to dump where? Which heart chamber receives deoxygenated blood? Our good old right atrium over here. So all of this deoxygenated blood from the walls of the heart itself also has to be dumped into the right atrium so that it can be sent out to the lungs to be reoxygenated. All right, so I'm going to have to refresh my view here, and we'll take a look at the major veins of the heart that you need to know. All right. Let me do the same thing I did before and hide the left atrium. That big blue vein right there is called the great cardiac vein. And it can also be called, this portion of it can also be called the anterior interventricular vein as well. I prefer great cardiac vein because if we rotate the heart around, you can see that, yes, it is extending next to the anterior interventricular artery that we were looking at before, but then it's also wrapping around and riding along next to and parallel with the circumflex artery that we were taking a look at. So that whole thing is called the great cardiac vein because it's so great. Actually, it's a pretty big vein. All right. Invisible body is not being nice to me right now. The heart is not doing what I want it to do. I can't get it rotated. Sorry, hang on. Let me pause so maybe I can get this rotated into the view I would like it to have. All right, I guess this is as good as it gets. All right, there's your great cardiac vein. All right, so that's carrying this deoxygenated blood, off of a large portion of your left and right ventricles. And that blood is going to continue to flow into right here. Let me deselect all, and now let me light that one up. This is called your coronary sinus, which is a big, thick vein. And we're over on the posterior side of the heart. And right in here we'd have our left atrium. I've stripped that off so we can see these blood vessels better. But that's carrying that deoxygenated blood. And notice what it's connecting into over here. This is our right atrium. So the coronary sinus connects into the back side, the posterior side of the right atrium. All right, now what about the deoxygenated blood from other parts of the heart? All right, well, some of that is flowing from, the walls of the heart, the walls of your ventricles over here and over here. It's eventually draining into, some of it, into this vein, and that is called your middle cardiac vein. And sometimes it's also called the posterior interventricular vein. And the reason for that is it is sitting there next to, this is the posterior interventricular artery that we were taking a look at before. So there's the artery. Here is your middle cardiac vein. So deoxygenated blood is flowing through this vein. Look what it connects into. It connects into the coronary sinus up here, which carries that deoxygenated blood over here into the right atrium. All right, but that's not all. We've still got some other deoxygenated blood we've got to get rid of. Let me fade the right atrium temporarily. Okay, because over here, this is all right ventricle that we see over here is leading up to the pulmonary trunk. And you do have smaller veins that lead to this larger blue vein that you see there. Okay, and this one as well is a larger vein that's carrying deoxygenated blood from a large portion of the right ventricle over here. This part of it is sitting next to the right marginal artery right there. So that's a good way to keep track of where a part of this vein is located. So that's the artery, and here's a portion of this vein that we're taking a look at. This one is called the small cardiac vein. So everything you see that's highlighted there in light blue, including a portion that runs along the right marginal artery, and then it runs in parallel along the right coronary artery as it loops along that border between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And they pass next to the inferior vena cava right there. And this is still small cardiac vein. It's actually not all that small, but it is also carrying deoxygenated blood over here to the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus is going to dump that blood into your right atrium that you see over here. All right, let me deselect those. Oops. Deselect all. Okay. Now you also, of course, have deoxygenated blood coming from, these portions of the heart as well, over on the right-hand side. And so you've got a vein there and a vein there, and they're connecting into this vein. And those are just referred to as anterior cardiac veins of the right ventricle. And you're going to have some individual variation from person to person there. So you actually don't have to be able to identify those. The only coronary or cardiac veins that you really need to be able to identify are the small cardiac vein, the middle cardiac vein, the coronary sinus, and those are really your only three that are dealing with blood flow around the heart that you have to know. All right, how about some homeostatic imbalances? And these are extremely important because these homeostatic imbalances are what kill a lot of people in our country and also around the world. The major homeostatic imbalances that occur are when you have blockages in a coronary artery, especially a large one. That's what can lead to a heart attack because you cut off oxygenated blood flow to portions of the walls of the heart, and then your cardiac muscle cells can't function properly. They don't have the oxygen gas and the glucose and other nutrients and things that they need to be able to function. And so guess what? If your cardiac muscle cells aren't contracting, your heart's not going to function properly, and that can wind up killing you. So this picture over here, they're showing you plaque buildup in coronary arteries. Those are fatty deposits that can develop in those coronary arteries and narrow the blood flow. That can lead to angina pectoris, which is thoracic pain, chest pain. And a lot of times that's the first major symptom that you have a blockage somewhere in one of your coronary arteries, because that restricted blood flow cuts off some of the oxygen supply to cardiac muscle fibers, and the cells can become weakened, and they wind up releasing chemicals that stimulate sensory nerves within the walls of the heart to send pain signals to the brain. That's important for your survival if you think about it. There's a reason why that happens. That's part of our homeostasis and survival mechanisms as well, because if you're overexerting yourself and you have blockages in coronary arteries, if you keep exerting yourself, you're more likely to have a heart attack. But if you're experiencing chest pain due to that exertion, that's going to be a signal to you, hey dummy, to quit overexerting yourself because you're in danger of damaging your heart even more severely. All right, a heart attack is also known as an MI, or a myocardial infarction. So we talked about infarctions earlier. That's where you have an undesirable blood clot. Back in chapter 17 on the blood, we talked about when an undesirable blood clot, a thrombus, cuts off the supply of oxygenated blood to a tissue somewhere. That's called an infarction. And in the heart, it's called a myocardial infarction because you're cutting off blood supply to the myocardium. And so like they're showing you here in this particular diagram, that can be due to the buildup of fatty deposits within the walls of a coronary artery. That can eventually cut off blood flow altogether. Also, when you have those fatty deposits in there, remember how we were talking about in chapter 17 that you don't typically get a thrombus along a smooth endothelium, that inner lining of a blood vessel, but if it becomes rough, that's more likely to stimulate platelet plug formation, and then that can lead to a thrombus, an undesirable blood clot. So when you start getting all these fatty deposits along the inside linings of your arteries, as we get older and due to poor diet, the surface in there gets rougher, and that stimulates platelet plug formation, which can lead to a full-blown blockage. And like they're showing you over here, if you have a blockage, like over here, they're showing you a full blockage in, this is, what major blood vessel is that? That's the right coronary artery because it's flowing between the right atrium and the right ventricle over here. So that would cut off a great deal of blood supply to the right-hand side of the heart, and could be deadly if not treated right away. And unfortunately, your myocardium, you don't really, once the oxygen supply gets cut off, like they're showing you there, kind of in blackish gray, that blockage could wind up killing all of those portions of the myocardium that you see there. You don't replace those cells. That gets replaced with scar tissue. Scar tissue is connective tissue that does not contract. So that would severely limit your heart function and could potentially kill you if it happened. Okay, so we keep talking about cardiac muscle tissue. In the next video lecture, we're going to zoom in and we're actually going to look at these cardiac muscle cells that exist within the walls of our heart and take a look at their function in more detail.